All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series, where we hope you find the next hour or so useful and informative. I'd like to go right into it and introduce our presenter, Mr. Steve Koster. He is president at Washington Laboratories Limited. Steve has over 30 years of experience in testing systems and devices for regulatory compliance. His expertise spans a full range of product evaluations from IT, medical, machinery, measuring, and communications, including wireless. He heads the Washington Laboratory team, accomplishing all manner of product compliance evaluations. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and turn our attention to updates to the RED 2025 cybersecurity requirements with Steve Koster. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Christina. Should be able to see my slide.
Yes, sir. We see it.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're listening from. There's been an update to the Delegated Act, or the Delegated Act has wanted to present this information for people to understand what's going on, basically. So how did we get here? The Commission delegated Regulation 2022/30 in October of 2021 supplements the Radio Equipment Directive by calling out Article 3.3 D, E, and F as being essential requirements. Now, they've always been there. I mean, since the beginning of the Radio Equipment Directive, those articles have been in the Radio Equipment Directive. They were just not tagged as essential requirements. So the regulation shall enter into force 20th day after the publication of the journal, but originally they were going to apply it from the 1st of August 2024. They realized that it was going to take a little longer than that, so they extended it to now where it will be in force August 1st, 2025. So on August 1st, you'll need to comply with these essential requirements should you be sending a radio that's applicable to these into the European Union at that time. So Article 1, the essential requirements, point D, applies to any radio equipment that can communicate itself over the internet, whether it communicates directly or via any other equipment. So it's internet connected radio equipment. So some of the things that come to mind would be Bluetooth devices that are connecting to your computer. They would fall under this regulation. Obviously, anything that connects directly to the network would fall under that as well. The second requirement in Article 3.3E applies to any of the radio equipment if that radio equipment is capable of processing within the meaning of Article 4.2 of the regulation, personal data as defined, or traffic data and location data. So anything that can give away information, personal information about people, places, etc., they fall under 3.3.E. And finally, the essential requirements in 3.3.F shall apply to any internet-connected radio equipment if that equipment enables the holder or user to transfer money, monetary value, or virtual currency as defined in Article 2.D of the Directive 2019/713. So, if you can make payments, if you can order stuff from Amazon, your phone, for example, they would fall under the requirements of Article 3.3F. Okay, so they're essentially, they brought these requirements in. So, we know that if there's a harmonized standard, we can work with it. But when this first came in, there were no standards that were listed as harmonized standards. So basically, any radio device that was going would need to have a notified body. Well, This is as of last week, but as of this morning, I checked the NANDO website, and there are 25 notified bodies that have been notified for Article D, E, and F, and none of them reside in the United States. They're all in Europe. So that could be a problem for everybody trying to get their product into Europe in August. So how do you assess it? The manufacturer facing challenges of assessing their product. Have to ask yourself some questions. What kind of technical assessment? What kind of tests do I need to do to meet the requirements? If I pick a selection of tests, is everyone going to agree with that? I mean, have I done enough to show that I comply with the aspects of these articles? When I pick my tests, how do I select some limits and levels? What's going to really apply? When I pick my tests, limits and levels, how do I perform that testing? Now, these are all things that we need to know as a manufacturer to make sure that we're in compliance of the requirements. And when the testing is performed, how do I know that the results are any good? How can I be happy with them? Was the testing performed correctly? It's really difficult sometimes to especially when you're working with out of standard. So what do we do now? Well, if there's a harmonized standard listed in the OJ without restrictions, those questions are easy because you go to the standard, it shows the tests, shows the limits, and the EC listing of the standard in the OJ is their way of accepting those questions. Okay, I've got the right standard, I've got the right levels and limits, the testing is easy enough to validate to make sure it's done right. So that's the easiest route. If there is no standard, because the technology is new and requirements completely new, such as this one, and none of the questions above have been answered, and the manufacturer has a tough job of answering all those questions. They might ask the test lab or consultant for help, of course, for establishing aspects like radio or EMC. We know approximately what types of tests should appear, but not much more than that, right? Because we've been doing EMC and radio testing for decades. If the standards exist and it was submitted to the EC but did not get listed in the OJ, then you might be in a situation where a selection of tests does exist, methods and levels, but it's been deemed unacceptable by the European Commission. So manufacturer has a basic framework to work from, but they can't just blindly follow the standard because they know it's not acceptable. So what do you do then? Manufacturer must research why the standard's not listed and amend their assessment to take those things into consideration. If testing's missing, limits wrong, or whatever, manufacturers got to account for that in their assessment. And all these assessments should be in your risk assessment file. Everything that you do needs that risk assessment file so you can tell what you've been looking at, etc. So if the standard exists and was submitted to the European Commission and was listed with restrictions, then it's quite similar to just above, except that all the research and explanations have already been provided by the European Commission, and the manufacturer does not need to do all that complicated research. They can be confident that the items 1, 2, 3, and 4 above are solved for any test case without a restriction. But for test cases with the restriction, most likely the European Commission did the research and wrote it in the restrictions for the manufacturer. So as you can see, manufacturer's risks, headaches, and costs can vary greatly. A is the easiest, of course, B, then C, and then B if you were going to rank these in order of difficulty and cost. So luckily, the end of January, these 3 standards were listed in the OJ, the official journal, EN 81031-1-2 and -3. But as you can see, they do have some restrictions. which we'll address later. So just a quick note, since CENELAC wrote these three standards, and in my opinion, they did them quite rapidly. They formed a working group October of 2022, and the standards were released, and I think it may be a little bit after August, but they were released in 2024, which is really a quick turnaround for going from zero to a standard and then having it harmonized at the end of January. So they pretty much correspond to the requirements of DENF. So 18031-1 is for internet connected radio equipment. 18031-2 is radio equipment processing data, internet connected radio equipment, childcare radio equipment, toys, radio equipment, and wearable radio equipment all fall under this requirement, or the standard. And the 18031-3, internet connected radio equipment processing money. Don't want that to get corrupt. So they've set up these main requirements, access control. They call them a mechanism. So what is your access control mechanism, the authentic mechanism, authentication, security, etc. And as you'll see over on the right-hand side, different parts of the different requirements for the different standards, -1, -2, and -3. So they all have a subset of some of them, and some of them have others, etc. This is a quick look at the standard. This is part of the table of contents for 18031-1. And you'll see it does have, the scope and the reference and all the definitions, etc., as typical standard does. And then it gets into the requirements. 6.1 is access control mechanism. And then it goes on into subcategories of, well, was that control mechanism? How is it applicable? Does it how is it appropriate? Those types of things. This is the requirement itself for access control. Equipment shall use access control mechanisms to manage entities' access to security assets and network assets, except for access to security assets or network assets, where, if it's public accessibility is the equipment's intended function, then yeah, you wouldn't need access control for that. If you have physical or logical measures in the equipment's targeted operational environment limit where accessibility to an authorized entity is not available, so if it's in your office and nobody else can access it except for you, it's kind of the way that reads. And then if legal implications do not allow for access, well, always legal. Got to them lawyers work it. So it's because security assets and network assets might be exposed to unauthorized access attempts. Access control mechanisms limit the ability for an unauthorized entry. So we want to make sure people that aren't supposed to have access do not have access. So what's the criteria? Well, we got to make sure we don't let people have access. So one of the big things, the required information, is description of each security asset that it's accessible by entities, including. So a lot of documentation will be required for this, because you've got to identify every possible entity's access to security asset on the equipment. So, how can you access this equipment? And if the access control by the equipment is absent for public accessibility of the security asset, the equipment's functionality, the description of the equipment's intended functionality concerning the public access accessibility of the security asset. So you can't just say, well, it has to be available to the public. You really need to tell them what the function is. Why is it that has the access, or has the ability to be accessed? Because the physical or logical logic measures have been in place, you have to document all of that. All right, make sure it's taken care of. And they have these cute little decision trees all through the standards. So you take the equipment, make sure each security asset and network asset that is accessible by entities is addressed. Come down to the first box. If public accessibility is intended, then it's not applicable. The physical or logical measures of the target operational environment limit access, it's not applicable. If no, then the legal implications, so then you are the access control mechanisms that manage entities' access to the security asset and network. Are they there? And are they what you need to have to make sure people do not get into that standard, that device? So it's just an example of what they have. So if you don't have your access control mechanism, then it's a fail, and you don't comply with the standard, therefore you can't ship it into Europe. So each one of the standards has a table 1 for the requirement structure, and it's kind of just a checklist to make sure that you look through it and you say, hey, okay, this is the access control mechanism, or whatever mechanism it is that you're looking at, and you just go through the steps. Is it applicable? What's the requirement? Rationale and guidance, we'll touch on that a little bit as we look at the restrictions. What is the assessment criteria? How do I know that unit's compliant? Can I tell that, we're taking care of that function? And then you just continue to follow it down through the checklist. And the standards got a lot of information on what you're looking for, and make sure that you do address everything. And it's actually, for as quick as they did it, it's not terrible. So you come down to towards the bottom, and the assessments that are conducted by examining the documented assessment cases. Not all assessments might be provided for every mechanism. So maybe you don't have all these things that you can address. But there's the conceptual assessment, where you examine if the provided documentation and rationale provided the required evidence. Do you have evidence by the documentation that you have your access control mechanism, or your whatever mechanism you're looking at? Is it there? Is it acceptable? Can I just state that what it is, and that will be acceptable to show compliance? Is that possible? But then there's, or do you have to go functional completeness? Functional is you examine and test if the provided documentation is complete. You use a network scanner to verify that all the internet interfaces are properly identified, documented, and assessed. So if you use a network scanner and you find the device has an interface that's not been identified, then you got a problem. You got to figure that out and turn around and account for that. Functional sufficiency, examine and test if the implementation is adequate. Run a fuzzing tool on the network interface to check if it is resilient to attacks with malformed data. You want to get into it. You want to make sure that the wrong password won't get you in, or you cannot access it. You can't get in. You can't have any thing happening when. So there are some that will require you run some tests on it. to show that it actually works. But that's, again, there's all of those requirements that needed to be addressed. So some of them you might be able to do with just documentation, but some of them you will have to test them. Okay, as you see here, this is from the official journal. This is the 18031-1, and it has some restrictions. They're called notices. Notice 1. Section named rationale and guidance of this standard do not confer the presumption of conformity. Well, I can't use those to show that the product complies with the requirements. And notice 2 is calling out a specific article, Article 3.3, first subparagraph D, if applying clauses 6251 and 6252, you wouldn't have presumption of conformity. The user is allowed not to set use any password. It's kind of a negative way to say that. But if you do not allow the user to set a password, then it's not going to, and we'll cover that a little bit. And you'll see the -2 has 3 notices, the first 2 being the same, rationale and guidance, harmonized standard, if you're not allowed to set a password. But then you've come to this 3rd clause about it's access control. And if you do apply these clauses, 6134.42, etc., parental or guardian access control is not ensured. You want to make sure that you don't negate that. And the -3, again, rationale and guidance, and it's the password. And then there's the Article 6.3.2.4 of the standard that does not show presumption of conformity, and we'll explain why that is the case. So notice 1, as we said, is rationale and guidance. That restriction is applicable to all 3 of the standards, as we saw from the official journal listing. The reasoning is the section named rationale aimed to provide a justification for the need to address certain risks. Section named guidance includes examples and considerations on the possibilities to implement certain mitigation measures. Neither of the 2 aforementioned sections set out specifications. There's no specifications, so it's like, no, that doesn't make it. If there's no specifications, we can't use it to show presumption of conformity. Well, do you need to have a notified body? Well, the aim of the restriction is to clarify that those sections are pure and informative nature, and therefore they're not linked to the presumption of conformity. So if you don't rest your hat on those, for example, to show compliance, then you'll be fine, because they are not. They don't show conformity by complying with them. Notice 2 has to do with default passwords. Again, those clauses offer manufacturers the possibility to allow a user not to set or use any password. It's considered that if this option is implemented, the relevant authentication risk will not be properly addressed, and therefore conformity with the essential requirements would not be ensured. So basically, when a user gets on that system, they have to set a password so that it's secure, so that the access control will work. So as long as you require a password, the user to use a password, you create a password and use it, then it does show conformity, and you can then no longer need a notified body. So you can use that entire standard in whole. And that's all 3 of the standards as well. We look at notice 3, which is specifically for the -2, where you're doing data, or you got to protect all of the data, these 6.1.3.4.2 for all these clauses, if you use them, they might not show conformity. So they include specifications on access control mechanisms for toy radio equipment and for childcare radio equipment. More specifically, the implementation categories described under the subsection assessment criteria are the following: role-based access control, discretionary access control, mandatory access control, or others. Certain of these categories might not be compatible with the parental or guardian control. In such a case, it is considered that if parental or guardian control is not implemented, the relevant authentications risk will not be addressed, and therefore conformity with these requirements would not be ensured. You can't have a child's toy that doesn't have parental controls or they don't work. So, but if that's the case, then you don't require a notified body to show compliance. You can self-declare. And notice 4 assessment criteria set out in this clause 6.3.2.4 of the harmonized standard. The -3 is the only one this applies to for point F. It's like harmonized standard -3 includes assessment criteria for security updates. There's 4 different implementation categories that are laid down based on digital signatures, secure communication mechanisms, access control, or others. None of the methods alone are sufficient for the treatment of financial assets. All right, so you can't use just one of them and show that it's compliant. It's considered that the assessment criteria do not properly address the relevant authentication risks and cannot therefore ensure conformity with the essential requirements of 3.3F. And fortunately for manufacturers, these do not show conformity, and third-party conformity assessment is mandatory. So you would need to have one of those 25 notified bodies and they might get quite busy between now and August. Okay. So, I mean, that's a quick run through. Okay, we've got harmonized standards now. You can use them to show compliance. As long as you address it correctly and go through all of the steps, then you can put a CE mark on your product and go ahead and ship it to Europe after the August 1st. Well, what's coming down the road? Well, they have the Cyber Resilience Acts, the CRA. They entered into force in December of 2024, and with the grace period, it's actually going to require compliant products on 11 December 2027. So that regulation applies to all products that have digital elements whose intended or foreseeable use includes direct or indirect logical and physical data connection to a device or a network. Things like your computer on your desk, if it doesn't have a radio right now, it doesn't have any cyber requirements, but you can get to the internet that way. So the Cyber Resiliency Act is taking care of everything, including the radios. That being said, there's a note in there that said, in order to avoid a regulatory overlap, it's envisioned that the commission would repeal or amend the delegated regulation with respect to the radio equipment covered by the proposed regulation. So basically, on 11 December 2027, these requirements will fall out of the red and go to the CRA. So there'll no longer be a radio requirement, there'll be a requirement for all electronic equipment. So just looking back, the commission had the delegated regulation, it applies as of August 1st. Standards were quickly written and harmonized with restrictions. Self-declaration is allowed only if the relevant harmonized standards family is applied to the product is not affected by restrictions, and the requirements move out of the red into the CRA December 11th, 2027. That's a quick look at the requirements right now as we see them. And at this point, I believe we have a few questions.
We sure do. Let's see, I'm gonna start with, let's see, what is the restriction in the condition the standard exists as submitted to the EC and was listed with restrictions?
The restrictions are listed here. This is part of the official journal. And once a standard gets published in the official journal, it becomes a harmonized standard. And once it's a harmonized standard, you can use that to show compliance for the well, this is the radio equipment directive. And therefore, you are able to self-declare. Now, if you see in this one, -1 has 2 notices, and those notices are the restrictions. Notice 1 says you can't use the rationale or guidance. And notice 2 says you got to make them set a password. So those are the restrictions for, and this is what, so basically since Senelec wrote the requirements, wrote the standards, submitted them to the European Commission, the European Commission actually came back from the first revision with somewhere on the lines of 3,000 comments. They addressed those comments over the Christmas holiday and got it back in for them to vote. And consequently, they accepted all of that except for these restrictions. So the notices that are shown in the official journal are what the restrictions are.
Okay, there you go. Let's see. The next question is there guidance explaining which standards apply when a device serves multiple purposes? For example, like a smartphone or mobile computer that can be used for any of the applications described.
Basically, it's just you look at everything on your device and you make sure that you comply with it. So a smartphone would have to comply with all 3 of these. It is a basic internet connected radio. It does process or has your personal data and location, and you can use it for financials. So you would look at it, and again, now you look at that table that I had set up about the requirements, and you'll see that access control mechanisms are across all 3. So you may be able to have one access control mechanism that complies with all 3 standards, but that device would have to comply with all of these standards in order to be considered compliant for the radio equipment directive.
Okay, very good. Okay, our next person has 2 questions. What should we do with the equipment that is already on the market? And do we need to assess it if it is no longer in production but still available in stock?
I would say that anything that's already on the market, you would leave, it would stay on the market, and we would not be required to go back and retrofit those or assess them. Because basically when you look at these, they talk about when you're placing it on the market after 1st of August, then it's required. So if it's already on the market, they're not going to have people go back. And they're not going to have people go back and reassess all the products they've done over their life. But they are going to make sure that anything coming in now will be compliant with the requirements.
Okay. So if we release an updated version of equipment that has already been assessed, do we need to reassess the updated version, assuming the design changes slightly, but the performance, purpose, and risks remain the same?
Simple answer is, as it moves into the European Union, it has to comply with the requirements. What what you need to do, or what a lot of manufacturers don't pay attention to, is the fact that you need to have a risk assessment file. So in this risk assessment file, you look at what areas you're going to have the risk in. What are my risks? How am I going to make sure I take care of that? And all of that will be outlined in your risk assessment file. So then you've updated the device, and you open your risk assessment file and you say, we've updated our device to include X, Y, and Z. And you go through, you say, this is not going to affect our compliance because of X, Y, and Z. So therefore the original assessment stands, and we state that it's still compliant, and we move on with selling it. So it's basically, you got to police yourself to make sure that this device, and if it does indeed change it, then you have to show the new assessment. Okay. So it's kind of, you've got to, as a manufacturer, make sure you have all this documentation. I tried to say that more than once: document, 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 because that's what's going to save you in the end, that you've shown that you've taken care of all the requirements, you've taken and addressed everything that you needed to address.
Okay, there you go. So how to define if the equipment is in the scope of the red article 3.3D?
Let's see. D is any kind of personal information. Like, I use my cell phone for navigating with my car. I pull up the maps, and my maps show where I'm at. That's personal information. I've got my name and my address. That's personal information. I've got, if it's any personal information that it's processing or even just passing through, that could be something that the hackers wanted, it is a requirement to comply with 3.3D.
Okay, great. Awesome. So another question, how can I enter the commentary process for CRA?
I would need to look that up. There's got to be a place on the European Commission's website, and they should have a spot there, but I have not used that, so I can't say for sure.
Okay. If a device such as IoT uses an external modem, does it still need to comply, or does just the modem need to comply?
That's a tricky one. IoT, if that device, the IoT device, is a radio link to the external modem and not a hard link, then it would need to comply right now, because right now the requirements are for radio devices under the Radio Equipment Directive. However, when the CRA comes into effect, it connects to a modem that connects to the network. So therefore, under the CRA, it will be required to be assessed and make sure it complies.
Okay. Let's see. Has checklist per each harmonized standard been published so a test lab or manufacturer can use to demonstrate conformity?
The checklist that I showed is in each one of the standards. So, I mean, you'll need the standard in order to show to read all of the requirements and be able to show compliance. So those can be taken right out of the standards. It's table 1 in each one of those standards.
Okay. Let's see. We've got lots of questions. It's great. Let's see. For medical equipment with radio function, the product should comply with medical directive only, or does it need both the medical directive and radio directive?
You're going to make me go back to the delegated act, aren't you? I believe the delegated act has some exceptions, and medical devices being one, because they have already have the ability to keep devices safe from hacking. I don't think I put that note in this, so I'd have to verify that, but I believe if you have the Delegated Act, the 2022/30, it does have on the first page there, I believe there's three different types of equipment that are exempt from this. But I can, if you send me an email or send an email to questions, I can verify that and send an email out.
Sounds good. Let's see, the password restriction is a bit confusing. To confirm, if a user is allowed to set the password, then the notified body involvement is not required. Are
Yeah.
default passwords allowed?
Yes. Okay. It is very confusing the way they wrote it. It's like, if you are not making them change the password, then it's not compliant, or if they don't have to use a password, then it doesn't comply, because then it kind of throws off your access control mechanisms. So
It has to be editable, right? I
it
mean, that's
has
pretty
to
much what they're
be
saying.
pretty much, they have to have a password, default passwords from the manufacturer. I believe in reading, you don't have a standard default password. They almost have to be unique per device. If I read that correctly, I can go back and look at that. But if you have a factory default password, as soon as the user accesses that the first time, they need to be forced to change the password for their own password, to have their own password, so that, the access control is taken care of.
Okay, let's see what else. So how do you explain if the equipment is connected to the internet directly or connected indirectly?
That's a good question. I did see in my research this week that there are two different opinions on that, and there's two different white papers that are written. But basically, if you can access, well, not even access, like right now I have a wireless mouse connected to my computer. So this wireless mouse now through my computer does have access to the network. So therefore it should comply with the requirements, right? You may have issues where you may have to where some of the mechanisms aren't applicable, but you still have to evaluate it and look at all the different mechanisms and make sure that that wireless mouse is not going to get hacked. Because, what can they see if they hit your mouse? They can see what you're moving on your screen, things like that. It's not a high risk device, but it's still a radio device that has some indirect access to the network. So somehow it has to be evaluated.
Yep, makes sense. Here's another one. Is the -3 applicable for devices that can run a browser and thus be used for purchases like transfer of money, etc.?
That is correct. If I can use it to order stuff off Amazon, Amazon takes my credit card, that's moving money, and -3 becomes acceptable, or becomes a requirement.
Okay. Well, that's about the end of the question queue here. Everyone's saying thank you. We're happy that they have an informative webinar here to know
Happy
what's
to
going
do
on.
it. With the standards being harmonized and having restrictions, it's going to help the manufacturer, because again, they'll be clamoring to get to working with those 25 notified bodies, if not. And how would you move product into Europe at that point? So
Yeah.
glad to do it. If you got any questions, there is an email, questions@WL Academy, that you can send questions into, and we can take and answer them for you and get you some information. Happy to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Steve. And as he just remarked, if If you didn't get to your question today, we are happy to take your questions. You can email them to, it's questions, plural, @WLL.com. And we'll respond as soon as we can. Just a reminder to everyone that a recording of this presentation will be sent out to all attendees. So you will be able to listen over and over again and probably get another tidbit of information with every listen. That was a lot of information. Anyway, again, our thanks go to Steve for taking the time out to enlighten us about updates to the cybersecurity requirements. I'll take this moment to say that our upcoming webinar will be Cybersecurity and the Cyber Resiliency Act. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you visit our website and subscribe to Washington Labs Academy to receive updates. You can visit us at WLL.com and click the training tab in the upper right corner, fill out your information where you see the sign up for updates. So, okay, on behalf of Washington Labs Academy, I would like to thank everyone for their attendance, and thank you once again, Steve. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting.
Thank
Thanks
you
very
all.
much.
Thank
Take
you very
care.
much.
Bye.
Bye.